Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 11 about public policy. It's Lesson 3 about public policy problems. In this lesson, you'll learn about irresponsible democracy, about kicking the can down the road, about bureaucratic inefficiencies, and about politicized solutions. In the previous lessons in this unit, we've learned about what public policy is, about the public policy process, and about some of the tools used to accomplish public policy solutions. Now we're going to learn about some of the problems that commonly derail those public policy solutions. The first of those problems can be seen in the fact that voters punish pain. Now, in a system of government that is based upon the consent of the governed, that they express through voting, obviously the will of the people is going to have a big impact upon the solutions that politicians choose to the problems that they face. Remember, they want to get reelected, so they've got to keep the voters happy. But this is difficult because voters hate painful things. For example, they don't want their taxes raised. At the same time, they don't want their benefits cut. So what this means for the government is that they are expected to provide certain things for the people, but the people aren't really willing to pay for them. So what kind of politicians then are the people looking for if these are their desires? To get stuff and not have to pay for it. Well, they're going to reward politicians who behave irresponsibly. A politician that stands up and says, I'm going to give you everything you want and you're never going to have to pay for it, is the one who's going to, unfortunately, get a bunch of votes. This then causes the politicians to create public policy solutions which are inherently irresponsible. Now, you would think, though, that this irresponsible behavior might eventually catch up to the politicians. In other words, if they keep avoiding solving a problem because it will hurt the people, eventually the problem will come back to bite them, and they'll kind of be forced to solve it. Well, politicians in the American system of government have gotten really good at kicking the can down the road. This is an old idiom that refers to the idea of, imagine you're walking down a sidewalk and there's an old rusty can laying on the ground in front of you, and you stub your toe into it. You look down, you see the can, it's rolled a few feet in front of you, and you say, stupid can, and you keep walking, and your toe hits it again. And it rolls a few more feet in front of you, and you look down, stupid can, you keep walking, your toe hits it again. The responsible thing to do would be to stop, bend over, pick up the can, and go throw it in a trash can. But in this idiom of kicking the can down the road, what the person does is they just keep kicking the can ahead of them, so they never have to bother to bend down and pick it up. All they're really doing is putting off the problem, not solving it. Politicians have gotten really good at that. They realize that the real solutions to the problems will cause the voters pain. Like, for example, been talking about how voters want benefits, but they don't want their taxes raised. One of the big issues facing America is the national debt. The national debt would require, if we're going to pay it off, either we find some way to get more money, such as potentially raising taxes, or we have to reduce the benefits being paid to people. Voters don't like either of those solutions. As a consequence, there's no real way to pay off the debt. So what do politicians do? They just keep pushing off the debt into the future. To pay the current debt, they borrow future money, and they just keep doing that forever, and the problem just keeps getting bigger and bigger. Now, why would politicians do that? They can't be so stupid that they don't realize that this is a big issue. They do, but they realize that if they tackle it, they will not win their next election, so they don't tackle it. They just push it off in the future for somebody else to eventually deal with. That is kicking the can down the road. And unfortunately, the way voters vote in America, politicians are encouraged to do that. Voters complain about them doing that in the abstract, but when it comes to the specifics of them wanting their benefits and not wanting their taxes raised, then They suddenly forget about the big debt down the road and want the politicians to act irresponsibly in the moment. So this gives us our first problem with public policy, and that is what we could call democratic irresponsibility. The fact that politicians have to go to the people to get voted in, and the people refuse to accept pain in the policies that are given to them, means that because of those democratic pressures, politicians have to behave irresponsibly. The next problem can be seen in something that we discussed earlier in this course. You may recall in the unit about the executive branch, we talked about the bureaucracy. Well, public policy is generally implemented through bureaucracies, and bureaucracies have some inherent problems that we talked about in that previous unit. The big problem to recognize is that in order for bureaucrats to keep their jobs, they just have to avoid getting in big trouble. This has been one of the findings that I presented a quote about in that previous unit, where they said there just seems to be very little accountability in the bureaucracies in government, where people can behave really badly and there's no consequence for them losing their jobs. Well, what that means then, if you're a bureaucrat and you want job security, you just need to avoid ever getting in really big trouble. And the best way to do that is to do as little as possible. Do nothing if you can. That's how you avoid making any mistakes, is just don't ever do anything. Well, that idea of avoiding getting in trouble by doing as little as possible is not going to make for very efficient public policy implementation. Matter of fact, it's going to be really, really poor. Another problem with bureaucracy that we discussed in that previous unit was this notion of red tape, you may recall. Red tape are these rules and procedures that the bureaucracy creates, and that helps them to avoid making the mistakes that may get them in trouble. But again, so many strict rules, so many strict procedures, makes it hard for anybody else to deal with a bureaucracy and get anything done. So you kind of take these things together and realize that most of these public policies being created by government are going to have to be implemented by bureaucrats operating under these pressures. And you realize that public policy oftentimes is going to be very inefficient. So that leads us to our second problem. First one is the politicians creating the public policy have an incentive to act irresponsibly. The second is the people they turn the policy over to implement it have an incentive to be very inefficient in what they do. The third problem is the politicization of the public policy process. Now, what does that mean? It simply means that the politicians that are creating the public policy are choosing to appease certain interested groups to help their political careers rather than really solve the problem. Let me give you a couple of examples where this might happen. A couple of the really big interest groups in Washington, D.C. that have a lot of power lobbying members of Congress trying to get them to do what they want are the National Rifle Association, an organization that represents gun owners, and the National Education Association, an organization that represents teachers. Now, both of these organizations have a lot of influence over members of government. They rally voters for people, for politicians, they give them donations, things like that. And as a consequence, the politicians creating public policy will oftentimes want to keep groups like this happy. So they'll continue to support them, they'll continue to get reelected, rather than really try to look for the best public policy solution to the problem at hand. So, for example, let's say the issue is regulating the purchase of firearms because you want to try to weed out the wrong people from getting guns. That's something that the National Rifle Association is probably going to be opposed to. They're going to talk about people's Second Amendment rights to own a gun, things like that. And the politicians are going to then quite rationally think about, maybe I'd like to make gun purchases tougher, but I'm afraid that would offend the NRA, and I want to get reelected too. So maybe what I should do is do what the NRA wants so I can get reelected, rather than what I think may be the best thing to do to solve this problem. Now, please, as I say that, don't assume that I'm thinking that the politician will be right or wrong in trying to pursue this solution. I'm just saying, imagine a politician that wants to pursue a solution regarding gun purchases, but then feels like they can't because they want to remain on friendly terms with the National Rifle Association. And so they craft a different sort of policy, one that, for example, makes it easier to purchase guns. They're actually coming to that conclusion not because they studied out the problem and decided that's what the best thing to do was, or because they wanted to respect the Second Amendment or anything like that. They're doing it for purely political reasons to help themselves get reelected. Another example can be seen with the NEA, the National Educational Association. Let's imagine you're a politician that you're worried about. You want to create tougher educational standards. You want to do stricter testing, for example, things like that. The NEA may, in fact, oppose that. Why? Well, if you do stricter testing, more students are going to fail the test. The teachers are going to look worse. Maybe as a result, they don't get as good of ratings. They don't get as high of raises, things like that. It's against the interests of the teachers to really have strict educational standards. So if you're a politician and you're thinking this is a good idea, then you find out that the NEA opposes it, you may well back off. And it's not because you actually think that the NEA has a better solution, perhaps. It's because you simply feel pressured by them. And so you adapt the policy to what they want rather than what you think is best. Now again, I'm not as your teacher here taking a stand on whether there should be stricter educational standards or not. This is just a hypothetical situation where there's a politician who believes there should be, who actually thinks that's the best solution, but then backs away from it for political reasons. These kind of things can happen often in politics. And so you end up with public policy decisions being made not on the basis of what will actually solve the problem, but based on what the people in politics think will best help them get reelected. So that gives us our third problem with public policy, that it is oftentimes politicized. In other words, rather than going for the best solution, they go for the things that will help interested political actors be happy and help the politicians get reelected. All right, let's review what we learned in this lesson. First, what often causes public policy to be irresponsible? Is it corporations that offer bribes to members of Congress? Is it constitutional restraints on what policymakers can do? Is it that politicians are stupid, that they don't understand what they're doing is irresponsible? Or is it that voters punish pain? It's the fact that voters publish pain that oftentimes causes public policy to be irresponsible. The voters don't want the real solution, particularly the real long-term solution. They just don't want to be hurt in the moment, which may not be the best thing to do. What does it mean to kick the can down the road? Does it mean put off dealing with a problem? Does it mean to make a problem bigger? Does it mean to work toward a solution? Or does it mean to eliminate a problem? Kicking the can down the road means to put off dealing with a problem. Why is public policy a problem for bureaucracies? Is it that they lack expertise, that they have inadequate funding, they have no authority, or they are just inefficient? In fact, bureaucracies probably have expertise, have funding, and have authority, but they still don't get the job done because they are simply inefficient for reasons we talked about earlier in the lesson. How is public policy politicized? Is it politicized because it requires a majority votes? Is it politicized because it helps groups, it helps a group rather than finding a solution? Is it politicized because government controls it? Or is it politicized because the bureaucracy changes after each election? Public policy is politicized because the politicians creating it want to help groups rather than find solutions. All right, that completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 11. It'll be Lesson 4 about public policy outcomes.